for New York and sending a message to the nation.
Welcome to this week's edition of New York Now. I'm Dan Clark. What do you do when you don't quite like someone? For Governor Andrew Cuomo, the strategy has been to blindside the people he doesn't agree with. And that was on full display this week as New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio and the governor once again decided to give conflicting information about the state's new COVID-19 clusters in the 5 boroughs. So let's talk about that with Jesse McKinley from the New York Times. He's with me in studio. Jesse, thanks for being here.
Of course.
What's wrong with these guys? Can you give our viewers some context? Why can't the governor and the mayor work together, especially with something as serious as a deadly disease that's killed over 200,000 people in the country?
That is a fantastic question. I think you have to take one step back, right? Which is that traditionally governors and mayors have not always gotten along in the state of New York. I mean, you can go back to John Lindsay and the Rockefeller administration. The first Cuomo and Ed Koch, so this is not new. However, the level of vitriol between these two men, between Bill de Blasio and Andrew Cuomo, has really hit a peak, and it has been going on for a long time. I mean, you can tick off a number of issues, whether it's the deer in the Bronx or more serious things like public housing, right? Where these two guys can't get along. And I think in this case, you had the mayor actually trying to do things to try to get the governor's attention. He kind of sprung this plan on the governor, and Andrew Cuomo does not like being surprised.
No.
So it was not then a surprise that the governor bashed back and said, no, this is my idea, we're going to do it my way. And thus the confusion that you talked about at the top.
So let's talk about the news, the idea that actually is going into effect this week for these new COVID-19 clusters, just so our viewers can get the details. So there's 3 zones, they're red, yellow, orange, and it depends on where you are. So we have clusters in Brooklyn, obviously,
yep.
Specifically Borough Park. We have clusters in Broome County, and then we have clusters in Orange and Rockland County. So the idea behind them, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the red part is kind of the epicenter of the cluster. Mm-hmm. That's where things are going to be severely limited in terms of businesses, houses of worship, schools being closed. The orange is right outside of the cluster where the infection rate hasn't quite gone up, but they want to keep it kind of restricted.
The warning zone, as they
exactly,
call it.
the warning zone. The yellow zone is
precautionary.
Exactly, even outer of the orange. Yeah. So think of a bullseye, basically.
Yeah. And I think what you're saying here is kind of the governor's propensity towards, complex solutions to problems. I think you remember a couple of years ago when they were negotiating the minimum wage, and the deal that came out of that was like over 6 years, 4 different parts, an agency, looking at it, et cetera, et al. And so for the governor, he likes things like this because it kind of gets into the gearhead, the kind of hyper-technical micromanaging element of the governor's personality. De Blasio wanted it to go by zip codes, which of course is a little easier to understand because pretty much everyone knows their zip code. So yet again, this is another point of conflict between these two.
So how is it being received? I guess the governor's plan that is going into effect.
The governor's plan is supposed to go into effect, I think today, Thursday, and is not being received particularly well. I mean, we've had very angry protests in Borough Park and other Orthodox communities in Brooklyn. I think they felt surprised by this as well. They had been assured that the restrictions on religious gatherings would not be as extreme as they turned out to be, and they are angry. How long that anger will take to dissipate remains to be seen, but I think the idea that this would somehow, go over well in communities that traditionally have suspicion of secular governments, I think that was a bad bet on the governor's part.
Yeah, if people aren't familiar with what you're talking about, head to WNYC or Gothamist's website. They have tons of videos from the protests in Borough Park. It is some really ugly stuff. A reporter was assaulted on Wednesday evening, I believe. Really just a lot to go over, but we have to leave it there. Jesse McKinley from the New York Times, thanks so much.
Of course.